Hi, this is Mrs. Chavez. Today we're starting Chapter 32, Section 1. This is World War II we're going to be looking at, and the first section talks about Hitler's Lightning War. So during the 1930s, Hitler played on the hopes and the fears of Western democracies. Each time the Nazi dictator grabbed a new territory, he would declare an end to his demands, and everybody believed him, of course, and peace seemed like it was going to be guaranteed until he moved again. And after his moves into the Rhineland and then Austria and then Czechoslovakia, Hitler finally turns his eyes to Poland. After World War I, the Allies had cut out the Polish corridor from the German territory to give Poland access to the sea. In 1939, Hitler demanded that the Polish corridor be returned to Germany. So Germany sparks a new war. The Soviet dictator at the time, Joseph Stalin, signed a 10-year non-aggression pact with Hitler. So Hitler did not want to fight on two fronts, as that happened in World War I. So he signed this non-aggression pact for 10 years with Stalin. And because he was excluded from the Munich conference, Stalin wasn't eager to join anyway with the West. So Hitler had promised him territory. And in a secret part of this pact, Germany and the Soviet Union, the USSR, agreed to divide Poland between them. They also agreed that the USSR could take over Finland and the Baltic countries of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. So as soon as Hitler signed this non-aggression pact with Stalin, he started moving very quickly with his plans to conquer Poland. His surprise attack took place at dawn on September 1st, 1939. German tanks and troops rolled across the Polish border. At the same time, German aircraft and artillery began a bombing of Poland's capital, Warsaw. France and Great Britain, of course, declared war on Germany on September the 3rd, but Poland fell sometime before those nations could actually get mobilized and get any kind of military response. After his victory, Hitler annexed the western half of Poland. That region had a very large German population. That's what we call irredentism, by the way. The German invasion of Poland was the first test of Germany's new military strategy, the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. It involved using fast-moving airplanes and tanks, followed by massive infantry forces to take enemies by surprise and quickly overwhelm them. In the case of Poland, the strategy definitely worked. On September 17th, Stalin sent Soviet troops to occupy the eastern half of Poland. Stalin then moved to annex the countries that had been agreed upon in their non-aggression pact. He went to the countries that were north of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and they all fell without a struggle, but Finland resisted. In November, Stalin sent nearly 1 million Soviet troops into Finland, and the Soviets actually expected to win a quick victory, so they were not prepared for all this winter fighting. This was a crucial mistake. The Finns were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fiercely defended their country. In the freezing winter weather, soldiers on skis attacked the Soviet positions. In contrast, the Soviets struggled to make progress through the deep snow. The Soviets suffered heavy losses, but they finally won through the sheer force of their numbers. By March of 1940, Stalin had forced the Finns to accept his surrender terms. After they declared war on Germany, the French and the British had mobilized their armies, and they stationed their troops along the Maginot Line. This was a system of fortifications along France's border with Germany. There they waited for the Germans to attack, but nothing happened. And with little to do, the bored Allied soldiers stared eastward towards the enemy. Equally bored, the German soldiers stared back from their Siegfried Line a few miles away. Germans jokingly called it the Sitzkrieg, or City War. Some newspapers referred to it simply as the Phony War. Suddenly, on April 9, 1940, Hitler launched a surprise invasion of Denmark and Norway. In just 4 hours after the attack started, Denmark fell. 2 months later, Norway surrendered as well. And the Germans then began to build bases along the Norwegian and Danish coast from which they could launch strikes on Great Britain. In May of 1940, Hitler began a dramatic sweep through the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. This was part of a strategy to strike at France. Keeping the Allies' attentions on those countries, Hitler sent an even larger force of tanks and troops to slide through the Ardennes. This was a heavily wooded area in northern France, Luxembourg, and Belgium. Now, moving through the forest, the Germans squeezed in between the Maginot Line, and from there they moved across France and reached the country's northern coast in just 10 days. After reaching the French coast, the German forces swung north again and joined with the German troops in Belgium. By the end of May 1940, the Germans had trapped the Allied forces around the northern French city of Lille. Now, they were outnumbered, and they were outgunned, and they were being pounded from the air also. So the Allies had nothing else to do but retreat to the beaches of Dunkirk. This was a French port city near the Belgian border. They were trapped with their backs to the sea. And in one of the most heroic acts of the war, Great Britain set out to rescue the army. It sent a fleet of about 850 ships across the English Channel to Dunkirk. Along with the royal ships were civilian craft, yachts, lifeboats, motorboats, paddle steamers, and fishing boats. They all joined in the rescue effort. From May 26th to June 4th, this amateur armada, under heavy gunfire from the German bombers, sailed back and forth from Britain to Dunkirk. The boats carried some 338,000 soldiers back to safety. Well, following Dunkirk, resistance in France began to crumble. By June 14th, the Germans had taken Paris. Accepting the inevitable, French leaders surrendered on June 22, 1940, and the Germans took control of the northern part of France. As you can see here on this map, the northern part of France up here, this area here. And the southern part of France, right here, where the Vichy government was, where the city of Vichy was where they allowed the puppet government that was headed by Marshal Philippe Pétain, a French war hero from World War I. So the headquarters of this government of the German collaborators was in the city of Vichy, right here. With the fall of France, Great Britain was alone against the Nazis. Winston Churchill, the new British Prime Minister, had already declared that his nation would never give in. Hitler turned his mind to an invasion of Great Britain. His plan was to first knock out the Royal Air Force, the RAF, and then to land some more than 250,000 soldiers on England's shore. In the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe, that's Germany's Air Force, began bombing Great Britain. At first, the Germans targeted British airfields and aircraft factories. Then on September 7, 1940, they began focusing on the cities, especially London, to break the British morale. Despite the destruction and the loss of life, the British did not waver. The RAF, although badly outnumbered, began to hit back. Two technological devices helped them turn the tide in the RAF's favor. One was an electronic tracking system known as radar. That was developed actually in the late 1930s, and radar could tell the number of and the speed and the direction of the incoming warplanes. The other device was a German code-making machine named Enigma. A complete Enigma machine had been smuggled out of Germany and into Great Britain in the late 1930s. Enigma enabled the British to decode German secret messages. With information gathered by these devices, the RAF flyers could quickly launch attacks on the enemy. To avoid the RAF attacks, the Germans gave up daylight raids in favor of nighttime bombings. At sunset, the wall of sirens filled the air as Londoners flocked to the subways, which served as air raid shelters. Some brought out the bombing raids at home in smaller air raid shelters or in basements. The Battle of Britain is what they called it. This continued until May 10, 1941. Stunned by the British resistance, Hitler decided to call off his attacks completely. Instead, he focused on the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe. The Battle of Britain had taught the Allies a crucial lesson. Hitler's attacks could be blocked. So that stubborn resistance of the British in the Battle of Britain caused a shift in Hitler's strategy in Europe. He decided to deal with Great Britain later. Then he turned his attention east to the Mediterranean Sea and the Balkans and to the ultimate prize, the Soviet Union. So Germany's first objective in the Mediterranean region was North Africa, mainly because of Hitler's partner Mussolini. Despite its alliance with Germany, Italy had remained neutral at the beginning of the war. With Hitler's conquest of France, however, Mussolini knew he had to take action. After declaring war on France and Great Britain, his next move was to move into France. Mussolini took his next step into North Africa in September 1940. While the Battle of Britain was raging, he ordered his army to attack British-controlled Egypt. Egypt's Suez Canal was a key to reaching the oil fields of the Middle East. Within a week, Italian troops had pushed 60 miles inside Egypt, forcing British units back. Then both sides dug in and waited. Finally, in December, the British struck back. The result was a disaster for the Italians. By February 1941, the British had swept 500 miles across North Africa and had taken 130,000 Italian prisoners. Hitler had to step in to save his Axis partner. So to reinforce the Italians, Hitler sent a crack German tank force, the Afrika Korps, under the command of General Erwin Rommel. In late March 1941, Rommel's Afrika Korps attacked. Caught by surprise, British forces had to retreat to Tobruk in Libya. After fierce fighting for Tobruk, the British began to drive Rommel back. By mid-January 1942, Rommel had retreated to where he had started. By June 1942, the tide of the battle turned again. Rommel regrouped and pushed the British back across the desert and seized Tobruk. This was a shattering loss for the Allies. Rommel's success in North Africa earned him the nickname of Desert Fox. If you look at some of these pictures here, you see the Desert Fox here on your left at the bottom, but the other pictures that you're seeing are what the Australians group. They're called the Desert Rats because of how they held out so well against Rommel and how they attacked him oftentimes in the middle of the night. While Rommel was campaigning in North Africa, other German generals were active in the Balkans. Hitler had begun planning to attack his ally, the USSR. Remember, they had signed a non-aggression pact, but Hitler was going to go back on this pact and attack Russia anyway. So as early as the summer of 1940, he had this plan in place. The Balkan countries of southeastern Europe were key to Hitler's invasion plan. Hitler wanted to build bases in southeastern Europe to launch attacks on the Soviet Union. He also wanted to make sure that the British didn't interfere. To prepare for his invasion, Hitler moved to expand his influence in the Balkans. By early 1941, through the threat of force, he had persuaded Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary to join the Axis powers. Yugoslavia and Greece, which had pro-British governments, resisted. In early April of 1941, Hitler invaded both countries. Yugoslavia fell in 11 days, and Greece surrendered in 17 days. In Athens, the Nazis celebrated their victory by raising swastikas on the Acropolis. So with the Balkans firmly in control, Hitler could move ahead with Operation Barbarossa. That's what it was called, his plan to invade the Soviet Union. Early in the morning of June 22, 1941, the roar of German tanks and aircraft announced the beginning of the invasion. The Soviet Union wasn't prepared for this attack. Although it had the largest army in the world, its troops were neither well-equipped nor well-trained. The invasion rolled on week after week until the Germans had pushed 500 miles inside the Soviet Union. As the Soviet troops retreated, they burned and destroyed everything in the enemy's path. The Russians had used the scorched earth strategy against Napoleon. On September the 8th, German forces put Leningrad under siege. By early November, the city was completely cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. To force a surrender, Hitler was ready to starve the city's more than 2.2 million inhabitants. German bombs destroyed warehouses where food was stored. Desperately hungry, people began eating cattle and horse feed, as well as cats and dogs, and finally crows and rats. Nearly 1 million people died in Leningrad during the winter of 1941 and 1942, yet the city refused to fall. Impatient with the progress in Leningrad, Hitler looked to Moscow, the capital and the heart of the Soviet Union. A Nazi drive on the capital began on October 2, 1941. By December, the Germans had advanced to the outskirts of Moscow. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov counterattacked. As temperatures fell, the Germans in summer uniforms retreated. Ignoring Napoleon's winter defeat 130 years before, Hitler sent his generals a stunning order: no retreat. German troops dug in about 125 miles west of Moscow. They held the line against the Soviets until March of 1943. Hitler's advance on the Soviet Union gained him absolutely nothing, but cost the Germans 500,000 soldiers' lives. Meanwhile, across the pond, most Americans felt that the U.S. should not get involved in the war. Between 1935 and 1937, Congress even passed a series of what they called the Neutrality Acts. These were laws that made it illegal to sell arms or lend money to nations at war. But President Roosevelt knew that if the Allies fell, the U.S. would be drawn into the war. In September 1939, he asked Congress to allow the Allies to buy American arms. The Allies would pay cash and then carry the goods on their own ships. Under this Lend-Lease Act, which passed in March of 1941, the President could lend or lease arms and other supplies to any country vital to the U.S. By the summer of 1941, Hitler ordered his submarines to sink any cargo ships they met in the Atlantic Ocean. Although the U.S. had not entered the war, Roosevelt and Churchill met secretly and issued a joint declaration called the Atlantic Charter. It upheld the free trade among nations and the right of people to choose their own government. The charter later served as the Allies' peace plan at the end of World War II. On September 4th, a German U-boat fired on a U.S. destroyer in the Atlantic. In response, Roosevelt ordered Navy commanders to shoot German submarines on sight. The U.S. was now involved in an undeclared war with Hitler. To almost everyone's surprise, however, the attack that actually drew the U.S. into the war didn't come from Germany, it came from Japan.